In this video, I'm going to be covering a carburetor needle shim adjustment, as well as basic disassembly of the bike, including removal of the gas tank, side covers, and seat. Removing these things isn't necessary to get out the carburetor, but it makes it a lot easier to see what you're doing and to get your tools in there. This is an adjustment you will probably be interested in making if you notice your bike isn't performing very well. My example is a throttle would respond with a super small inputs and wide open, but nothing in between. There was a large dead zone and the bike would not accelerate if I didn't have it wide open or super small on the throttle. The only tools you should need to perform this work is a 10mm wrench, a pair of pliers, and a screwdriver set. Some of the screws on the carburetor are Japanese industrial standard, but I found that a good medium to small sized Phillips head screwdriver will do the trick. So the first thing we're going to do is remove the seat, and you just need the key for that. There's a key port right here on the side. You'll just do a twist. Sometimes you need to push down right here on the seat to get it to release. And then just this center portion lifts up. You don't want to try grabbing this because it won't go anywhere. Once the seat is off, you can remove the side covers by simply using a Phillips screwdriver on the one screw right here. And be careful to get the washer with it. And then pull out on this top corner and then pull up and the whole cover will slide off. On the other side is just one screw. And once the screw is out, this cover goes straight off the bike. So this one you need to lift up to get off this peg, but the one on the right side goes straight out. The first step for removing the gas tank is to come down here and locate on the back of the fuel petcock. You'll see this vent line coming from the carburetor, and that should just slide straight back. Next up, I'm going to disconnect the fuel line from the side of the carburetor. And before I do that, what I'm going to do is place a rag just to catch some of any gasoline that might drip off of here. And the previous owner of this bike decided to put hose clamps on here, so I need to use a screwdriver, but you might have just regular clips on your fuel line. It's worth noting to leave the petcock in the on position. These bikes need a vacuum line that we disconnected previously in order to make fuel flow out of this petcock into the carburetor. So a little gas will come out when we disconnect this, but you don't have to worry about the entire tank emptying. I'm going to go ahead and get a bottle and attempt to catch some of the gasoline. Using a twisting motion, I'm able to slowly get the line to come off. You might need to take a pair of pliers and just gently twist, and if it's been a while since the fuel line's been disconnected. And then we've got just a little bit of gas coming out. One thing you could do if you'd like, just to be safe, is to pinch off this line. And I'm just gonna put a little bit of fabric on here and a pair of vice grips that aren't too tight and simply give it a little pinch. The last step to get the tank off of here is to just loosen these 10mm bolts right here and pull them out. Now when you pull up on this seat bracket, you'll notice that there are two rubber bushings that are directly under it, and then pull up on the back of the tank. And be sure to remove these bushings that were underneath the tank, as you might accidentally drop it on the floor and lose it. So I just pull them out before I even get the tank off. Once you've removed the vacuum line from the petcock, the fuel line connecting to the carburetor, and the two bolts underneath where the seat connects, the tank will simply slide back and off. Here's a closer look at the rubber mount that the tank slid off of. So the tank was grabbing it like this, and I simply slid towards the back of the bike, and it slid right off on both sides. Continuing with disassembling the bike, we're gonna now pull off the carburetor, and we already have the vent line disconnected that went to the fuel tank, and it just slid right off. So now I'm going to take the choke off, and for that, I'm going to use a 14mm wrench to break it loose. And from there, it should just hand loosen. Just like so. On the right side of the bike, there's a line coming off the bottom of the carburetor, and that's the overflow line for fuel. So I'm just gonna put it here in a bottle, and I'm gonna loosen the screw that's right here behind the idle adjustment, and that should drain gas out of the carb. There, you can hear it trickling now. And that's just gonna make it a lot less messy to get this thing off. And once it basically stops, you can just tighten that back up so you don't forget later. Doesn't need to be too tight with these brass screws, or else you'll strip them off. Once the fuel is drained, you could take this little clip off and remove the overflow line if you want, just so you have more space while you're doing other things. So I'm just gonna slide the clip down and pop the line off, and it slides off real easy. I'm gonna put the clip back so I don't lose it. There we go. Next up is removing the throttle cable assembly. Now I would normally come in and try to loosen these two Phillips head or Japanese industrial standard heads right here, but they're already stripped. So I'm gonna have to loosen the adjustment right here and slide the cables off that way. Once you get the nut loose enough, you should be able just to slide it right on out. And then the cable swings on around down here and into the throttle arm. So you can pivot it around, and the bead at the end of the cable will come right out. And then we'll do the same thing for the throttle release. And we've got one line right here, so that's just as easy as sliding the clip off and giving it a gentle tug, and it'll come right off. Back on the left side of the bike, the last thing we have to do to get this carburetor off of here is loosen these clamps. And I usually loosen them to the point where they easily slide like that. Now we are free to go ahead and pull the carburetor out, and the easiest way to do it is give it a spin just to make sure it's loose, and then push towards the back of the bike. While pushing towards the back of the bike, you'll just want to swing the front of the carburetor to the right, and it will come on out just like that. So now that we've got the carburetor off and inside here, there's only a couple tools that you need to go ahead and do the needle adjustment. And for that, you'll need a large screwdriver for taking off the screws on the cap here, and a pair of needle nose pliers. You want to make sure that you get a nice large screwdriver, because these are kind of big screws, and it will help you with getting them cracked. I've already broke mine loose, so they were nice and easy. And then there's a spring underneath the black cap, so you just want to make sure that you can hold that down until you can slowly lift it. Get those two screws out, and then there's a spring under here. So this rubber diaphragm is kind of brittle, or it can be brittle depending on how old your bike is. So just be careful with that. And then we're going to take our needle nose pliers and get at the plastic tab right in here. And there's also a really tiny spring attached to the end of this. So you'll just want to be very careful when you are pulling that out to not lose the spring. And sometimes the whole assembly might come with it, and that's just fine if it does. And from there, I'm just going to gently twist and pull. And there, as you can see, there's a little mini spring that might go flying, so make sure you keep an eye out. And then the needle itself, you can just push up on it and grab it on out. So if you look at this, you will see this plastic piece, and you can kind of twist and push that down. And then there's a washer on top. Be very careful with that washer, because that's what we're going to be putting underneath the circlip right here. Again, using my needle nose pliers, I'm just going to gently tug back on the circlip. And it comes off just like that. And then you'll take your washer that you just removed and put it above the plastic piece. And then grab a hold of your circlip and just simply press it back into place. And it should click on there and then spin freely once it's installed. So now you have the washer underneath the circlip. And then putting your carburetor back together is just simply reversing the steps. So I'm going to put the needle on into the diaphragm, drop it in carefully. And then I'm going to grab a hold of this plastic guy here. And there's a rubber seal on there. So when we install it, we're going to make sure that that rubber seal is pushed in. Looks like it's good. And then putting the diaphragm back in is as easy as lining up the shape there. And then you can look inside and see your needle. You want your needle to go back in the bottom of the carb. And just carefully drop it in. And then you'll grab your spring. And then when you're installing the cap, you'll notice there's these little pegs on it. And those pegs help you to get the carburetor put back in, or the cap put back on the right orientation. So I know that it goes this way. And you can kind of just wiggle it from side to side to get that diaphragm centered underneath. And then you'll see it will push together flush. There's no gap in here, so then you're good to put your screws on. And you don't want to over tighten these. It really doesn't take that much tightness to do the job, and it will make it easier the next time that you have to take this apart. You won't risk stripping off your screws. Just like that, it's put back together. Quick side note, the richness adjustment screw is right here underneath the intake to the engine, and there might be a little brass cap in there that you will have to use a drill to pop out, to break out. Some people use a Dremel on there, but that'll give you access to the richness screw. What you want to do before you make any adjustments is tighten it down, so clockwise, and count how many turns it takes. Half, 1, 1.5, 2, 2.5, 3. And then make sure you take note of that, so if you make any adjustments, you can always return it to the original setting. Now, putting everything back together is as simple as reversing the steps that you used to tear apart. I'm going to go ahead and cover it anyways. So to get the carburetor in, we'll put it in from the right side. And then we're going to look at the air intake on the back of the carb. And we're just going to try to get that aligned with the rubber boot as best we can. And then using a little twisting action, I was able to get it in on the back. And then for the intake side, there's a little rubber notch cut out on the top of the boot. And there's a metal notch on the carburetor that slides right up in. So you'll kind of hear it click like it just did. And then get your clamps lined up, and we're gonna go ahead and tighten them down. Again, you want to make sure that the clamp is on straight and is in the grooves that the rubber already has. And both of my clamps actually tighten down to the point where the metal is touching on both sides. Next, I'm going to install the choke cable once again. And to do that, I'm actually going to apply the choke, which will draw in the choke plunger. And you should be able to get this started by hand screwing it. And since it's a brass piece, you want to be careful that it's going in straight. If it feels too tight, then you're probably cross-threading, so you'll want to back out and try again. Sometimes it helps to give the cable a little wiggle while you are tightening it. Once it's most of the way as tight as you can get it with your hands, just take your wrench, 14 millimeters, and give it a couple small turns. Again, you don't want to over tighten that, it's not necessary. On the right side of the bike, I'm going to go ahead and put in the throttle return cable by putting the bead in like that and letting the cable run up along the side, and then feeding it into here and tightening it back down. I'm going to use my 10 millimeter wrench to give it a little bit of a tighten. And then we're going to do the same thing with the other throttle cable. My throttle cable actually had a little bit of slack in it, so I backed this adjustment nut off of this top piece a little bit. And then I'm just going to tighten down the nut here and apply the throttle. Looks good. Next, I'm going to put this line back on the side here. Make sure it's all the way against the carburetor and put your clip back to the groove that it was in before. And then we're going to grab the overflow or the drain line, and we're going to feed it back through over the piece of frame that the motor mounts to, and we're going to put it back up on the little spout and put your clip back into place, and make sure that your drain screw is tight if you loosened it previously. The vent line going to the petcock, we're just going to route it back to the other side of the bike underneath the wiring, so that way we can more easily attach it later. And then we're going to go over to the other side of the bike. And now we're ready to go ahead and put the fuel tank back on. So I'm just going to kind of set it in place and try to line up the C shapes on the inside with those rubber bushings. And it should slide right on, nice and squeaky, means that you did it right. And then of course we need to reinstall the bolts at the back of the gas tank. So take the rubber bushings from before and carefully slide them up into the holes. Take these smaller bushings. There's one side that has a bigger divot in it. This side has a bigger divot, so it goes down. Seems to fit on there a little better, so it must be correct. And then take your seat bracket with this groove towards the back of the bike and line it up. You should be able to hand tighten these bolts in most of the way. And if it's not going easily, then you're probably cross-threading. And give it a small tighten with your 10 millimeter wrench. These don't have to be super tight either. Once the gas tank is on, if you look from the front of the bike at your vent line here, you'll see it connects to this little nipple right there. So we're just gonna slide that right on. And make sure it's all the way up against the petcock. And then we'll be set to attach the fuel line. And then the last thing we need to do is connect the fuel line, of course, to the fuel inlet. So we're just gonna push that up and on. And using a little twisting, I can get it to slide all the way up against the carburetor. And then put your clip in place. And now I'm going to continue by reinstalling the side covers. So I'm going to slide it down on top of that peg at the bottom. And then I'm going to line up the top corner here. And make sure it's nice and secure and the cable is lined up into the groove. And then I can take my Phillips screwdriver and go ahead and tighten down this top screw. I wouldn't go very tight with these, just that way you don't risk stripping them off in the future. And now all you have left is to put your seat back on. So you'll want to slide this groove at the front of the seat up underneath this bracket. And it should go in nice and easy. Give it a push and you're done. Before starting the bike for the first time, you can take the fuel petcock and move it down to the prime position for a few seconds. And what that'll do is it'll allow the fuel to flow freely into the float bowl of the carburetor to fill it with gasoline before trying to crank it over. And after that's been sitting for a few seconds, return it to the on position, which will require the vacuum from the engine in order to push fuel through the petcock. After making this adjustment, there was no longer a dead zone in the throttle travel. No matter where I would put my hand in the throttle, the bike would respond appropriately and predictably. In addition, the bike seemed to warm up quicker, only requiring the choke to be on for 1 or 2 minutes of driving. If you have any questions, please post them in the comment section below. Otherwise, good luck and stay safe out there.